Hey guys, so as I was looking through things, I kind of realized that there's a few other water features that I probably need to kind of go over before we kind of got into the effects of humans on areas. And the reason for this is because there's parts of a river that, or rivers are typically what carry pollutants to further downstream and pollute on a larger level. So there's some things you can do that kind of help. So basically, we need to talk about some stream habitats real quick before we move on to other stuff. So that's what this is, and I'm going to go pretty quick. You can always pull this stuff up and look at it. Not expecting you to memorize it, but basically a stream habitat. This is looking down on a river, so this is like an aerial view. And then these cross-sectional views here is kind of confusing if you kind of don't have the bearings. But if you drew a line from A to B, and then you kind of rotated yourself down to where you could see the cross-section of the river, that's what this section will be here. So at this area of the river, there's uniform depth across the river channel from A to B, right? So this one over here, notice that this pool is a deep section moving from A to B, right? And then this riffle thing is like a little rocky area that's shallow, and then you move back out of the river. So that's kind of what this means, or what this gets your bearings straight. So let's talk about these habitats. Remember, there's erosional and depositional zones that create these habitats. So let's look at the glide or run first. It's basically an area of a river where you have uniform depth across the channel, which means that the water flows pretty smoothly through there, and it's not turbulent. So it's just kind of flowing through at a nice, gentle pace. Speed of the water doesn't have anything to do with it. It's just that because there's no depth changes, there's not a difference in how fast the water's flowing across the channel for the most part. And then this is going to be a riffle, this area here where rocks are really close to the surface. It's a shallow area that's rocky, and that's an area where when water moves through it, it becomes turbulent because the rocks are so close to it that it kind of forms little rapids. And that actually helps, remember, agitation increases dissolved oxygen, so that helps dissolve more oxygen in the river or in the water. Then these pools are areas where you've eroded away at the surface or at the bottom of the channel, and you've created deeper sections. And notice that pools are usually on outside turns. This river is running this way from left to right. And so usually pools develop on outside turns of the river. So here's the pool, here's the pool, here's the pool, right? And pools are going to be deeper areas. The water will be less turbulent through pools. That doesn't mean it's moving slowly, but typically as you move lower in the water there, things will be calmer, as it were. So those are the three like in-stream habitats. And then you could talk about bars and banks, but we're not going to worry too much about that. What we really want to look at is the area outside of the river that's terrestrial based. And it's essentially the area next to the river and adjacent to the river, and it's called the riparian zone. And these riparian zones basically are really, really, really probably the most important habitats to a river in terms of water quality. If you can take care of the riparian zone, then you can take care of the river water quality. So just to kind of run through this real quick so you can see it, a riffle was turbulent flow, a run is non-turbulent flow, and that's channel depth is pretty good there. Usually runs they call faster flow, glides are slower flow, but they're usually over uniform depth across the channels. Then pools are deeper areas where flow usually is a little bit slower, and then riparian zones are zones of vegetation adjacent to the river edge. So moving on, there's three types of streams, and all of these are based on water being available. Perennial streams, perennial means all year, so these are going to have water in them all year. intermittent streams will have dry times and wet times. And the reason we talk about these, perennial streams typically will carry more pollutants downstream because they're there all the time. Intermittent streams dry up and have times of dry, times of wet, so typically they aren't as good at moving pollutants, but they can move larger amounts of pollutants in shorter amounts of time, if that makes sense. So if you accumulate pollutants in a dry time in that area, and then all of a sudden it becomes wet, now we can move all those pollutants at once downstream. Then ephemeral streams are really fleeting. What ephemeral means, it comes for short periods of time. So ephemeral streams are just wet in seasonal times. So when it rains, they get wet. When it doesn't, they don't. So think desert stream on that. Then how do those streams get their water? There's two types of water inputs or water, how water stays in streams, I guess. You could have gaining streams, which are usually your perennial streams, but they always have water in the stream bed, and that's because their stream channel dips below the water table. And there's always water in the stream. Then losing streams, typically they're losing water from the stream bed into the ground, so they're drying up. So these would be your intermittent streams. When enough water soaks into the ground, the stream is dry at that location. So if you know, gaining streams have water always coming in from the ground, and then intermittent have water always going into the ground, then you would probably be okay. Here's a picture of that. So notice the water table line, the stream cuts through it. This is a gaining stream. Water is going into the river from the ground. And then when you're below the water table, basically your water will be lost to the ground. The stream will dry up. So just to quickly go through those habitats and the benefits of those, or the importance of them. Riffles have high dissolved oxygen. They also serve as high insect populations. I said most insects start their life in water, so this is where they typically live, in riffly sections. There's usually a high population of small fish there. They're hunting those insect nymphs usually, and then they also serve as great fish spawning grounds because of the little rocks. There's crevices to lay your eggs in that protects them, and then it's also high in dissolved oxygen, which is what those fish eggs typically will need. So usually fish will spawn in those areas. Glides and runs, usually larger species of fish will live there. They're also going to hunt there. Usually glides and runs are right after riffles, and so things get kicked out of the riffles in the turbulent water, and will drop into the glides and runs. So fish will typically hunt things there, and then the water typically is slowing down enough to where now plants can start to take hold as well. So you start getting aquatic vegetation there. And then pools, again, larger fish can be there because they're deeper. Water at the bottom of those. And then larger macroinvertebrates. Macroinvertebrates are invertebrates that are big, so things that don't have a spinal cord but are large. So like crawfish, freshwater crabs, if you're talking about rivers. Basically, decent-sized critters that don't have backbones. And then algae and other aquatic vegetation can also grow better here in pools because they're moving a little bit slower. Eddies are another in-stream component that wasn't on the list, but they can kind of happen in different areas of a stream, and it's basically just a broad area of circulation. So you'll have an area, it's kind of like a whirlpool, and I've seen it where, out on the Trinity, I've seen where the water is flowing downstream on one side of the channel, and then on the other other side of the channel it's flowing upstream, and all that is just a massive eddy, and so eddies can serve as kind of a mixer where things get trapped in that circular whirlpool. So fish could use that as a hunting ground, and then it's also in those cases of those really long sections, it's a pretty good kind of a rest stop, as it were. Usually somewhere near the center, it's pretty calm, and there's not a lot of movement, and so it's a gentle place where things can rest. Then the last is the riparian zone, and again, it's it's basically just the area next to the river, and the better you treat your riparian zone, then the better the water quality of that river will tend to be. So this picture up here kind of shows two different philosophies. This side of the river is a good riparian zone. This side of the river is a bad riparian zone. And what usually happens when you have a good riparian zone, as long as you protect it, it serves as a filter to the river. So if anything, all of these animal waste products over here have time to be processed by the ecosystem, the natural ecosystem that lives here, before things are input into the river. Over here, this cow is really close to the river. It poops, it gets washed in. It doesn't have time to be processed by the natural environment, and so it becomes a contaminant to the organisms that are in the river. Also, there's some other things that happen here erosion-wise. If these cows are tracking through here, tearing up grass and all that, the next time it rains, that grass or that mud gets washed into the river, so it erodes at the riverbank, and it creates these steep cliffs, which then trees can't root well, and they fall over into the river, which clogs the river, and all sorts of bad things happen. See Trinity River Greenbelt near Lake Elizabeth. A lot of mountain trees, because it used to be that they're trying to revive that area. It used to be that this was allowed, and now they're moving back towards this, so people can't get their cows right up next to the river, and slowly it's remediating the problem, but it takes time. So riparian zones control erosion, add nutrients to the stream flow, also limit pollutants from stream flow, and then they also provide a habitat for more diverse food web interactions. Remember, we talked about the more diverse the food web is, the more subtle big disruptions will become, because there's more things that can take their place. So by having a really natural area, we increase the amount of food web interactions, which keeps the ecosystem as a whole more healthy. That's stream components that we kind of need to know for when we talk about what we need to talk about in terms of what we do when we mess upstream. So let me jump over to that real quick. Let me move some things around here. I think I need to be here. Yeah. So I'm going to try to be quick with this, but in terms of government intervention in water quality issues, what we really need to do is flash back to 1970s. Really, it's the 60s where things start getting ramped up. There's a book called Silent Spring that comes out that talks about environmental issues, and in the lost, it's called Silent Spring because the birds don't chirp anymore because they've been killed by DDT. But anyway, that book leads to a lot of environmental reform. And in 1970, the government passes the Clean Air Act, which basically says that we need to have clean air, and it's municipalities and industry's job to provide clean air and monitor for clean air and meet certain standards that give us clean air. To that, in 1972, they decided, you know what else we need? We need clean water. And so the Clean Water Act was born, which basically says the same thing as the Clean Air Act, but it needs to be, but in terms of the water. So we need to have rights to clean water. So it requires government entities, local government entities, and industries to meet performance standards to ensure pollution control. It makes state governments set water quality criteria, and then also ways to monitor and fix problems if they develop. And then it also provides fundings to states, provided that they meet the bill of their monitoring efforts. And then it also protects, ultimately, the environment, specifically with respect to water environments. So with that, the government, with the Clean Air Act, the government enacted the agency that is in control of that. That's called the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. You've probably heard about them in the news. So they're the guys that are responsible for overseeing the Clean Air and Water Act for the United States. And then what they do is they essentially say that local governments need to take care of that. So states have to come up with their own branch of the EPA, which in Texas used to be a bunch of conglomeration of committees, like the Railroad Committee and Energy whatever and blah blah blah. And then they decided in 2003 that they needed to consolidate that and make something that made more sense. And so they came up with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or the TCEQ, which is the governing body of Texas for the EPA and water quality standards, and air quality as well. So if you ever hear about the TCEQ, they're the guys that are basically the EPA in Texas. And basically what they do, or what the EPA does, is they're going to look at water in light of 5 beneficial uses that the public should be able to use water for and not worry about it being contaminated and for these uses. So those 5 uses, the primary uses that kind of gauge water quality, is going to be aquatic life and wildlife support, fish and shellfish consumption, drinking water supply, recreation, and agriculture. Now, if you look at each of those, just go through them quick. Basically, they're saying that a water body should be able to support good ecosystems, good healthy ecosystems, and so in that sense, it should be a suitable habitat for the survival and reproduction of not just fish and all this other stuff, but just food webs in general, really. Then fish and shellfish consumption. If we're eating stuff that comes out of a waterway, we need for it to not have contaminants in it. So basically, if you're using it for food production purposes, then it needs to be clean. And then drinking water, that should be pretty straightforward. If you're drinking it, then they need to understand that we need to be assured that it is safe to drink. Then recreation-wise, if you boat or play or swim in and around that water, it needs to be free of contaminants that could cause harm. So this says that there's 2 types, primary contact, secondary contact. I'm not going to get into that too much, but basically primary would be like if you could potentially drink it more readily on accident. So you're swimming in it, you're frolicking in it. That's primary contact. You're actually immersing yourself in the water. Secondary contact is you're probably not going to get wet, but things that you're using might be wet and you might touch it, so you could have some interaction with it. But again, I'm not going to agriculture is the 5th beneficial use. So we raise cattle and crops for food. So using non-contaminated water on that is probably going to be good for us in the long run. So we monitor for that. Then there's 3 other uses that haven't quite made the big list, but are monitored to some degree by municipalities, especially to ensure that we are using relatively clean water for these purposes. And those are landscaping, both commercial and residential, and then power generation, which is using water to turn turbines to create electricity, and also to cool electrical production plants. And then which is also along the same lines of industrial processing and cooling. A lot of industry pulls water from rivers, does stuff with it to like cool equipment or whatever, mix with equipment, and then it pushes it back out into the river. So trying to make sure that it's clean when it goes out is pretty important as well. Then there's 5 I guess assessment marks for understanding or for being able to use water for those 5 beneficial uses. And so basically when the EPA comes in and they're going to monitor your waterway or whatever, they're going to give it a score of 1 to 5. 1 means that it's great, use it for whatever you need to use it for. Number 5 means don't go near it, don't touch it, because you're probably going to get disease, right? And so 1 is good, 5 is bad. Basically, a 1 fully supports overall use. 2 is threatened. That means it needs attention. We need to worry about it. We need to look at it. We need to figure out what's going on. When you get to 3, it's like, hey, like red flag, let's fix this. And then 4 is like, oh my God, we might have to shut this thing down unless we fix it. And then 5 is, man, you ain't gonna fix that. Let's throw up a fence, put a sign on it that says stay out, enter at your own risk. There's actually a lake down in Carrollton that is surrounded by a fence and has TCEQ signs all on it because it used to be next to a battery plant and it was contaminated with heavy metal toxins, so it is shut off to the outside world. So that's number 5, right? So no, 1 is good, 5 is bad. So what we really look at though is the EPA, or Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, for the most part is looking at bacteria first. That's the easiest one to check first, and that's usually the thing that makes us the sickest most acutely, meaning quickest. So for example, if there were contaminants from, like, say, heavy metals, that might make us sick over like decades. But if there's contaminants from bacteria, think food poisoning, that's going to make you sick like immediately. So anybody that is in that area using that water typically will become ill. So that is an acute problem that needs to be fixed quickly. So really the first thing that the EPA looks for is going to be coliforms or pathogens. And coliforms are just bacterial colonies. That word came from E. coli, was the first bacteria that was really heavily studied. It's the one that lives in your gut and digests your food for you, gives you nutrients. But basically when that thing gets out of your gut, so if you eat it, then you get food poisoning and you get sick and bloody diarrhea, no bueno, right? So, but it was the one that they started kind of studying first, and a coliform is basically a colony of bacteria that's growing on a petri plate, and it represents on a plate. If you see it, it's just a little white. It doesn't have to be white, but a little substance that's kind of formed a little ball there on a petri plate, and that ball can have millions of bacteria in it. So it's a colony of bacteria, and specifically what they look for is fecal coliforms, which are coliforms from feces, usually of animals, and then we really want to go even further, and if you can find the ones that typically come from warm-blooded animals, E. coli is typically that one, and that one usually is the one that makes us the sickest if we ingest it. So really we want to look for coliforms in general because those make us sick, but then and fecal coliforms, which tend to make us sicker. But then even sicker is ones that come from mammals. So we typically want to kind of start high and then narrow it down. And if they're all there, then it's not bueno, right? So basically, there's some. I'll skip that. There's some obvious ramifications of this. There's limits, standards for water use in relation to coliforms, and the first is drinking water. So if you're using it for drinking water, how many poop coliforms do you want to drink? Probably 0. So that's what the government says should be in your water. Now, recreationally, you can have some more, 200 fecal coliforms per 100 milliliters. Now remember, a coliform is not a single bacteria, it's a colony of bacteria. So typically 200 coliforms would be 200 million bacteria. So water is literally teeming with these bacteria, but it takes a lot of them typically to make you sick. So there's higher thresholds as you get away from consumption consumption purposes. So fish and wildlife habitat will have up to 5,000 coliforms per 100 milliliters. And then shellfish, you're going to eat that. So shellfish and fish consumption, 14 fecal coliforms per 100 milliliters is the max. So those are our government standards for fecal coliforms across the juices, and that's usually where we start for our purposes. So, like for example, if you remember in Snowmageddon, we had the boil water ban, or the boil water notice. The reason we had that is there was a drop in pressure in the lines, which they're worried that it could be a break in the line. If there's a break in the line, then pathogens could be introduced, mostly in the form of bacteria, could be introduced into the water, and then that water still pipes to your house, and then you drink that water without boiling it, and then you get sick. You basically get food poisoning from your water. So they want you to boil it because that kills most of the pathogens that could be in there, which you can then relatively safely drink. So the reason, like, we got a boil notice on Thursday, and then they said, we will let you know on Saturday if you can return to drinking the water. And the reason for that is because they use these. Okay, this is a coliform count test. And if you were here right now, we're actually doing this in class. But this guy is kind of an orangey red color. And that is indicative that there is no coliforms in here. So this little broth is in a sealed tube. It's sterile right now. We have gone out around campus today, and we have gotten water samples from outside and inside different places, drinking water, bottle filling stations. And we have put a milliliter of water in here, and we are going to come back and check in 24 hours. And if this is yellow, then that means that there are coliforms present. That means that you would not want to drink from wherever we got that water. Why does it take 24 hours? That's how long it takes for the bacteria to grow and reproduce, and then basically send out a messenger that says no bueno and turns this thing yellow. If we come back in 24 hours and this thing is this color, that does not mean your water is safe. We have to wait 24 more hours. At the end of that 24 hours, if it is still this color, we would lift the water boil notice, because that means there are no coliforms present. So why did we close down on Thursday and then we couldn't find out until Saturday? Because they did this very test on the system. They basically take these, put a milliliter of water in there, let them sit for 24 hours, check it, and then if it's not yellow, that's a good sign, but you got to wait another 24 hours. If it's not yellow after 24 more hours, then we can say you don't need the water, it's safe to drink. So we have that ongoing right now. We are also going to be using some of these plates, and these plates have a little red jello-y substance in there. We put a milliliter of water in that, and it will grow bacterial colonies for us. What we are going to do is we are then going to isolate those colonies, and we are going to see if we get a yellow hit, and then if we get a bacterial fecal, these grow fecal coliforms, or actually just coliforms, but if we get coliform hits on this, we are then going to transfer these coliforms to a Petri plate, grow them further to try and isolate them, and then we are going to test and see, using their morphology, what the first step in identifying them would be, so we can tell if they are probable E. coli or probable some other bacteria. So basically we're going through the first, pretty much the first 48 to 72 hours of testing on your water supplies for bacterial contaminants. And what we find from that, if we were to find that there are bacterial contaminants, if it's in the drinking water, obviously we need to fix it because you're not allowed to have any contaminants. But if it's just outside the front of the school, then we should be falling below these recreation or fish and wildlife habitat realms. If they're too high above those realms, then we need to kind of probably stay out of there. But anyway, that's where we're headed. That's where we're going, and I will be kind of updating you guys on the line with what we find in here as well, in case you're interested. And then So that was a lot of information. I will try to abbreviate the quiz for this as much as possible, but it might be a little bit longer than some other ones.